A cowboy saved a stranded Apache girl. Unaware, he'd just walked straight into a deadly trap. The sun beat down on the Arizona desert like a relentless hammer. The dry earth cracked beneath Jackson Cole's horse as he rode along a narrow trail. Jackson was a tall man with broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, and eyes that had seen too much of the harsh world. He was a cowboy who had spent most of his life riding alone, tracking cattle, and surviving the wild deserts and canyons of the West. He knew the land, every curve of the hills, every hidden creek, and every shadow that might hide danger. Today, though, the desert seemed emptier than usual. The wind carried a dry, hot taste that made Jackson tighten the reins and scan the horizon. He had been riding for hours when something unusual caught his eye. At first, it was just a small figure, barely moving in the distance. Then he saw her clearly, a young girl sitting on the ground, her head bent low, her shoulders shaking slightly. Her clothes were torn and dusty, and she looked as if she had been walking through the desert for days without rest. Jackson slowed his horse and studied her carefully. He could see fear in her eyes, but also a strange strength, like she had already survived more than most children could imagine. Jackson had seen many people in need, but something about this girl made him act immediately. He nudged his horse closer, keeping his voice low and calm. "Hey there, little lady. You need some help?" he said gently. The girl flinched, backing away slightly, her small hands pressed against the dirt. Her dark eyes were wide and suspicious. Jackson knew she was scared, but he also knew that if he didn't act carefully, she might run, or worse, collapse from exhaustion. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his tone soft. "I just want to help. Do you have water?" He loosened the saddlebag on his horse and pulled out a canteen of water. The girl hesitated, then slowly stepped closer. Her movements were cautious, almost like she had been taught to trust no one. Jackson held the canteen out to her. She took it with trembling hands and drank quickly, her throat making small, desperate sounds as she gulped down the water. Jackson watched her carefully. "You've been walking for a long time," he said. "Where's your home?" The girl shook her head. She did not speak, but Jackson could see the pain in her eyes. She was lost, alone, and afraid of something he could not yet understand. He realized he needed to act fast. "Okay," Jackson said. "We'll get you somewhere safe. Can you ride a horse?" The girl looked at him, confused, then at the horse, which was patient and calm, waiting for her. Slowly, she nodded. Jackson lifted her carefully onto the horse, making sure she did not fall. Her small body shook, and she held on to him tightly. He could feel her fear and exhaustion. As they started moving again, Jackson could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. The desert was too quiet, too still. The wind seemed to whisper warnings through the dry bushes and twisted trees. Jackson kept his hand near the gun at his hip, ready for anything. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Little Hawk, seemed unaware of the danger, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert but wary. The trail led them toward a small, dried-up creek bed. Jackson knew this route would take them closer to safety faster, but the desert was unpredictable. Rocks shifted under the horses' hooves, and the wind carried the scent of something unfamiliar. Jackson's instincts told him to be cautious. He had survived ambushes, storms, and wild animals, and something about this day felt different. Little Hawk finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. They are coming," she said, looking back over her shoulder. Jackson's heart tightened. "Who is coming?" he asked. She did not answer, just shook her head and stared at the horizon. Jackson did not push her. He knew that asking questions could make her shut down completely. For now, he had to focus on keeping them safe. Hours passed as they moved through the harsh desert. The sun began to sink, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red. Jackson noticed how the light changed the shadows, turning rocks and cliffs into strange, dark shapes. He kept the horse steady, and Little Hawk clung to him, silent and watchful. She seemed to know something, some danger he could not yet see. Suddenly, Jackson spotted a movement in the distance, a flash of color, a shadow among the rocks. He tensed, gripping the reins tightly. "Stay close," he whispered to Little Hawk. The girl leaned against him, her small hand gripping his arm. Jackson's mind raced. He had faced outlaws and thieves before, but this felt different. Whoever or whatever was out there was watching them, waiting for the right moment. Jackson decided to take a small detour, moving toward higher ground to get a better view. As they climbed, he noticed more signs of movement: broken branches, disturbed rocks, footprints in the dirt. It was clear now that they were not alone. Someone had been tracking them, and Jackson knew they needed to be careful. They finally reached a small ridge, and Jackson scanned the area. He could see the vast desert stretching out below them, dry and dangerous, but for the moment, it seemed quiet. He let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Little Hawk looked at him with wide eyes.
We will be safe soon?" she asked softly.
Jackson nodded, though he knew nothing was guaranteed in this land. "We'll find somewhere safe. Don't worry," he said. As the sun dipped lower, Jackson made a decision. They would head toward the nearest Apache camp. He had met members of the tribe before and knew they would take in one of their own. Little Hawk's eyes brightened at the thought, but she remained silent, her mind clearly on something else. Jackson sensed her fear, but also a strong determination. She was not a girl who gave up easily. The journey was slow and careful. Jackson made sure to keep the horse moving steadily while avoiding obvious paths that might be traps. Every now and then, he would glance back, scanning the desert behind them. The feeling of being watched never left him. He had learned long ago that danger often came when least expected, and he could not afford to let his guard down, not with Little Hawk depending on him. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Jackson found a small, sheltered spot near a group of rocks and made a temporary camp. He helped Little Hawk down from the horse and offered her some dried meat and bread. She ate slowly, still wary, but Jackson could see the hunger in her eyes. They built a small fire, the flames flickering against the dark desert. Jackson kept one hand on his gun, the other close to Little Hawk, ready to protect her if necessary. The girl finally began to speak, telling him bits of her story in broken words. Her family had been attacked, and she had fled, not knowing where to go or whom to trust. Jackson listened carefully, offering comfort without pushing her to say more than she wanted. The night was quiet, except for the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. Jackson knew they were not completely safe, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. He looked at Little Hawk, her face illuminated by the firelight, and realized that she was brave beyond her years. She had survived the desert, the sun, and her fear. She had survived because she refused to give up. Jackson felt a quiet respect for the girl. He had saved many lives before, but something about Little Hawk made him determined to keep her safe, no matter the cost. He knew the desert would not forgive mistakes, and the bandits, or whoever was following her, would not give up easily. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever came next. As the fire crackled and the stars filled the sky, Jackson thought about the journey ahead. He did not know the dangers that awaited them, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not let this girl face them alone. Together they would survive the desert, the dangers, and the unknown that lay ahead. And in that moment, a quiet bond formed between the cowboy and the Apache girl, a bond that would carry them through the trials to come. The desert night was cold and dark, but Jackson kept the fire alive and watched over Little Hawk as she slept. He could feel the presence of something unseen in the distance, but he did not let it distract him. He had faced death before, and he would do it again if necessary. For now, the most important thing was to keep the girl alive and safe no matter what. And as the night stretched on, Jackson and Little Hawk rested, unaware of the greater dangers waiting beyond the horizon, ready to test their courage, wits, and the bond that had just begun. Morning broke slowly over the Arizona desert. The sky was a pale orange, and the first rays of the sun warmed the cracked earth. Jackson Cole stirred from his sleep and glanced at Little Hawk. She was awake, her dark eyes alert and scanning the horizon. The fire from last night had burned low, leaving only small, glowing embers. Jackson checked their supplies carefully. Some dried meat, a little water, and a few small pieces of bread remained. It was not much, but it would have to do until they reached safety. Little Hawk stood and stretched, her small frame still thin but strong. She had survived the night in the desert, and Jackson could see that her fear had not broken her spirit. She looked at him and said quietly, They are close." Jackson frowned. He had noticed strange footprints in the sand yesterday, and now the feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. "We have to keep moving," Jackson said softly. "We can't stay in one place for long."
Little Hawk nodded and climbed back onto the horse, gripping the saddle tightly.
Jackson adjusted the reins and led the horse along a narrow path through the canyon. The desert was quiet, almost too quiet, and Jackson's senses were alert for any sudden movements or sounds. He had learned long ago that danger often came without warning in these parts. The canyon walls rose high on either side, casting long shadows that shifted as the sun climbed. Jackson could see every rock, every bush, every possible hiding spot for an ambush. He moved carefully, choosing the path that offered the most visibility while avoiding areas that looked too risky. Little Hawk rode close behind him, her small hands gripping the saddle. She was silent, but her eyes darted around constantly. Jackson realized she knew more about the land than she let on. Her movements were careful, deliberate, almost like she could sense danger before it happened. Suddenly, Jackson noticed a flash of movement above him. He stopped the horse instantly and squinted upward. A small rock tumbled down from the ridge, hitting the ground near them with a sharp crack. Little Hawk gasped and pressed close to him. Jackson's hand went to the gun at his hip, but he did not draw it yet. He had to see what he was dealing with first.
"There. Here," Little Hawk whispered. "There. Waiting." Jackson's eyes scanned the canyon walls.
Sure enough, he could see faint shapes moving along the ridges, shadows against the rocks. Outlaws, men with rifles, hidden and ready to strike. Jackson's heart tightened. He had hoped to avoid trouble, but it seemed the desert had other plans. "Stay close to me," he said. "Don't make any sudden moves." Little Hawk nodded, her small hand gripping his arm. Jackson guided the horse slowly along the path, keeping his eyes on the ridges above. The outlaws had chosen their trap carefully. The canyon was narrow, and any wrong move could send a bullet flying. Jackson had faced ambushes before, but this one was clever and well planned. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the outlaws made their first move. A loud shout echoed through the walls, and rifles fired from above. Jackson acted quickly, pushing Little Hawk down behind the horse's neck and pulling his own gun free. Bullets whistled past, kicking up dust and small stones. Jackson returned fire, aiming carefully at the shadows where the shooters were hiding. The echoes of gunfire filled the canyon, bouncing off the walls and making it hard to tell where the bullets came from. Little Hawk, despite her fear, did not panic. She grabbed a few rocks from the ground and began throwing them toward the attackers, not to injure them but to create noise and distraction. Her movements were quick and clever, forcing the outlaws to shift their aim and giving Jackson small openings to move. Jackson realized that the girl's survival instincts were sharp. She was not just a child in danger, she was a partner in this fight. The horse reared and whinnied, startled by the sudden chaos. Jackson held it steady, speaking in calm, low tones to keep it from bolting. Little Hawk leaned close, her small body pressed against his side. Jackson felt her heart racing, but her courage was clear. She was terrified, yes, but she was not giving up. That made him respect her even more. The outlaws continued to fire from the ridges, but Jackson had a plan. He guided the horse toward a narrow bend in the canyon where the walls created a small overhang. Bullets struck the rocks around them, but Jackson ducked low and returned fire, aiming with precision. Little Hawk continued to throw stones, creating confusion. The outlaws were skilled, but they had underestimated Jackson and the girl. Suddenly, one of the outlaws slipped while trying to aim from the ridge. Jackson saw his chance and fired carefully. The outlaw tumbled down the rocks with a cry. The others froze, shocked by what had just happened. Jackson used the moment to push the horse forward through a small side path, a route he had noticed earlier. It was risky, but it offered a chance to escape the trap. Little Hawk clung tightly to him as they moved through the narrow path. Her small hands gripped the saddle, and her eyes were wide with fear and determination. Jackson could feel her trust in him, and it made him fight harder to get them both to safety. The path twisted and turned, and Jackson used every ounce of his skill to keep the horse balanced. Rocks shifted underfoot, and the sound of gunfire echoed behind them, but they pressed on. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, Jackson found a small ravine where they could hide. The walls were high and the entrance was narrow, making it difficult for the outlaws to follow. He helped Little Hawk down from the horse and quickly led the animal inside. The ravine was dark, but it offered some safety. Jackson set up a small campfire, careful to keep it low so it would not attract attention. Little Hawk sat quietly, catching her breath. Jackson offered her some water and a little food, and she accepted slowly, still shaken by the attack. "You did good," Jackson said softly. "You helped me more than you know." Little Hawk looked at him with a mix of pride and surprise. She had never thought of herself as strong or brave, but in this moment, she realized she had survived a real fight. Jackson studied her carefully. "We're not safe yet," he said. "They'll come after us again."
We have to be ready. Little Hawk nodded, her face serious now.
She understood that the desert was full of dangers, and trust had to be earned and protected. Together, they made a plan. Jackson would watch the entrance to the ravine while Little Hawk kept an eye on the higher ground. They would wait until the outlaws left or until they found a safe path out of the canyon. As they rested, Little Hawk began to talk more about her journey. She spoke in short, careful sentences, telling Jackson how her family had been attacked by a group of outlaws from another area. She had fled into the desert, not knowing where to go or whom to trust. Jackson listened, offering comfort without pressing too hard. He realized that the girl's story was more dangerous than he had first imagined. The outlaws who had set the trap were not random. They were connected to the people who had hurt her family. Night fell again, and the desert became colder. Jackson kept the fire low and the horse close. Little Hawk huddled beside him, her small body shivering slightly. Jackson wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility. He had saved her once, but he knew that the journey ahead would be even harder. The desert was vast, the outlaws were clever, and the girl's enemies were still out there, waiting for the right moment. As the stars appeared overhead, Jackson thought about the day's events. He had saved a life, yes, but he had also walked straight into danger. The outlaws had been ready, and the fight had only just begun. He looked at Little Hawk, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and realized that this girl was braver than many grown men he had known. She had survived hunger, fear, and the desert itself, and she had stood by him in the middle of an ambush. Jackson knew that the only way they would survive was by working together. He had experience, but Little Hawk had knowledge of the land and instincts that were sharper than most. Together they could outsmart the outlaws, navigate the desert, and find safety. But the road ahead was dangerous, and Jackson could not afford to make mistakes. Every step, every decision could mean life or death. As the night deepened, Jackson kept watch while Little Hawk slept briefly, exhausted from the day's events. He thought about the canyon, the ambush, and the men who had tried to kill them. They had escaped, yes, but only by a narrow margin. The desert was full of surprises, and Jackson knew that more challenges were waiting just beyond the horizon. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the faint scent of danger. Jackson tightened his grip on his gun and scanned the darkness. He had saved Little Hawk from immediate danger, but the journey was far from over. The desert would test their courage, their trust, and their wits in ways they could not yet imagine. And Jackson understood something clearly. He would not let this girl face the challenges alone. They were alone in the vast desert, hunted and outnumbered, but they had each other. And in that bond lay their only hope of surviving the deadly trap they had unknowingly walked into. The morning sun rose over the desert, painting the rocks and sand with warm orange and gold light. Jackson Cole sat quietly in the small ravine, keeping watch while Little Hawk slept. The night had been tense, and the sounds of the desert were slowly returning to normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze stirred the dust around the rocks. Jackson's thoughts were heavy. They had escaped the ambush, but he knew the danger was far from over. Whoever had set the trap was clever and determined. When Little Hawk woke, she was careful not to make sudden movements. She stretched her arms and yawned, glancing up at Jackson with her dark eyes full of curiosity and caution. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. Jackson nodded. "For now," he said, "but we can't stay here. We need to move, find a safe path, and plan our next steps." Little Hawk climbed onto the horse carefully, still learning to trust him fully, and Jackson guided the animal out of the ravine. As they rode slowly through the desert, Jackson noticed how sharp and alert Little Hawk was. She pointed out small trails, hidden water sources, and areas where wild animals might be hiding. Jackson realized she had grown up in these lands and knew their secrets better than he had ever imagined. Her knowledge of the desert was a gift that could save their lives. They stopped near a small hidden spring that Jackson had seen from a distance. The water was clear and fresh, and he helped Little Hawk drink and refill their canteens. She watched him silently and finally spoke. "My family, they didn't survive," she said quietly. Jackson's heart tightened. He knew the girl had faced horrors he could only imagine, and now she had no one else to rely on but him. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but we'll get through this. I promise I won't let anything happen to you." Little Hawk nodded, her small hand brushing his as she held her canteen. Jackson saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. It was small, but it was a start. Together they had survived an ambush, and now they needed to find a safe place to rest and plan their next move. Jackson led the horse along a narrow ridge, carefully scanning the horizon. He knew the outlaws could be anywhere, hiding behind rocks or waiting in the shadows. Every step had to be careful. Every decision could mean life or death. Little Hawk followed closely, silent but attentive. She had learned quickly from the previous day's events and was starting to act as an equal partner in their survival. By midday, they reached a small cave tucked behind a rock formation. It was hidden from view and offered shade and protection from the sun. Jackson helped Little Hawk inside and tied the horse nearby. He checked the cave for signs of danger, making sure there were no hidden threats. Once he was certain it was safe, he finally allowed himself a moment to relax. Little Hawk explored the cave quietly, her eyes wide with curiosity. She found small crevices in the rocks and pointed out where birds nested or where water sometimes collected after rain. Jackson smiled, impressed by her awareness. "You know this land well," he said. "You can teach me things I never knew." Little Hawk smiled faintly, a small sign of the trust that was beginning to grow between them. As they rested, Jackson thought about the outlaws and the trap they had fallen into. They had been clever and dangerous, but Jackson knew that by staying alert and using the terrain, they could survive. He needed to teach Little Hawk a few skills that could help them in case they were attacked again. He showed her how to move silently, how to watch the shadows for movement, and how to use the land to hide. Little Hawk listened carefully, absorbing every word. Hours passed as they trained and rested. Little Hawk asked questions, and Jackson answered patiently, explaining the ways of the desert and the tricks of outlaws. By the afternoon, she was moving with more confidence, her fears slowly giving way to determination. Jackson could see that she was learning quickly, and he felt a deep respect for her courage. She was small but strong, clever, and brave. She had survived more than most people could handle, and she was not done yet. As evening approached, Jackson decided they needed to move again. They could not stay in the cave too long, or the outlaws might find them. He helped Little Hawk onto the horse and led the way down a hidden path that wound through the rocks. The path was narrow and uneven, but Jackson had ridden it before and knew it offered safety from anyone following them. Little Hawk held tightly, her small hands gripping the saddle, but she moved with confidence. Suddenly, Jackson stopped. He had seen something strange in the sand below, a set of footprints leading away from their path. He knelt down and examined them carefully. "They're close," he said, his voice low. "Someone is following us." Little Hawk's eyes widened, but she did not panic. She had learned from him, and she knew that staying calm was their best chance. Jackson led the horse along a different route, weaving through the rocks and keeping to higher ground. Little Hawk pointed out a small stream in the distance, hidden by bushes. They followed it carefully, using the water to hide their tracks and cover their scent. Jackson was impressed by her knowledge and instincts. She had been in the desert longer than he realized, and her skills were helping them survive. By nightfall, they reached a small mesa that offered a clear view of the surrounding desert. Jackson set up a low fire, careful not to make too much light, and let the horse rest nearby. Little Hawk sat beside him, tired but alert. She had learned quickly, and Jackson could see the pride in her eyes. She was no longer just a frightened girl. She was a survivor, a fighter, and his partner. They ate a small meal together, sharing dried meat and bread. Little Hawk spoke more about her family, about the attacks, and about the outlaws who had chased her. Jackson listened carefully, giving her comfort and understanding without judgment. He realized that the girl's past was filled with pain, but her courage and determination were stronger than any fear. After the meal, Jackson taught Little Hawk a few more survival skills. He showed her how to find edible plants, how to track animals, and how to move quietly through the desert at night. Little Hawk absorbed everything quickly, asking questions and practicing each skill. Jackson was impressed by her intelligence and resilience. She had survived the desert and the outlaws, and now she was learning to survive even better. As the night grew darker, Jackson and Little Hawk huddled near the fire. The stars sparkled above, and the desert was quiet, except for the occasional howl of a coyote. Jackson thought about the journey ahead. The outlaws were still out there, and danger was never far in these lands. But he also knew that with Little Hawk's courage and his experience, they could face whatever came their way. Little Hawk looked at him and whispered, "Thank you." Jackson felt a warmth in his chest. He had saved her life, yes, but she had also taught him something important. Courage was not just about fighting. It was about surviving, learning, and trusting others when the world seemed against you. They slept lightly that night, taking turns keeping watch. Jackson stayed alert, listening to the desert sounds, watching for any sign of danger. Little Hawk rested beside him, trusting him completely. He could feel her small hand brush against his arm as she fell asleep, a silent bond forming between them. They had survived the ambush, learned from it, and grown stronger together. The next morning they set out again, moving carefully through the desert. Jackson kept the horse steady while Little Hawk pointed out hidden paths and safe water sources. They worked together, each learning from the other. Jackson admired her courage, and Little Hawk learned to trust his experience. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but they were no longer alone. Together, they were stronger than any danger that might come their way. As the day went on, they encountered small signs of wildlife, tracks of deer, birds flying low, and the distant howl of wolves. Jackson explained to Little Hawk how to read the signs, how to know when danger was near, and how to move quietly without leaving tracks. She listened carefully, absorbing every lesson. Jackson could see that she was growing more confident, more capable, and more ready for the challenges ahead. By evening, they found a hidden canyon that offered safety and shelter. Jackson tied the horse and helped Little Hawk inside. They made a small fire, cooked a little food, and rested. The desert was quiet, but Jackson knew that danger could appear at any moment. He stayed alert, teaching Little Hawk to do the same. They were a team now, and their survival depended on trust, skill, and courage. As they slept that night, Jackson thought about how far they had come. They had escaped an ambush, survived the harsh desert, and learned to trust each other. Little Hawk had proven herself brave and intelligent, and Jackson had learned to respect her strength. They were ready for whatever challenges the desert might throw at them next. And in that moment, under the stars and the quiet desert night, a strong bond was forming between the cowboy and the Apache girl, a bond that would carry them through danger, tests, and trials in the days to come. The desert morning was quiet, almost too quiet. Jackson Cole stood at the edge of the hidden canyon, scanning the horizon for any signs of the outlaws who had ambushed them days earlier. Little Hawk sat beside him on the horse, her dark eyes alert, scanning the rocks and distant hills. She had grown stronger and braver since the attack, but Jackson knew she still carried fear. He could see it in the way her hands gripped the saddle, in the way she flinched at every sudden sound. Yet there was also determination. She was no longer a frightened child. She was a survivor, ready to face danger. Jackson had studied the terrain, looking for ways to turn the tables on the outlaws. He had realized that they could use the desert to their advantage. The rocks, the ridges, and the narrow canyons could all become weapons if they moved carefully. Jackson explained his plan to Little Hawk in quiet, steady words. "We're not going to run this time. We'll make them come to us, and we'll use the land to fight smart, not just fast." Little Hawk nodded, understanding every word. She had learned from him, and now she trusted his judgment completely. They moved slowly along a ridge, the horse stepping carefully over the rocky terrain. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke from a distant campfire, and Jackson knew it could be the outlaws regrouping. He signaled for Little Hawk to stay low, and together they crept toward a narrow canyon that led to a higher vantage point. From there, Jackson could see the flat desert below, perfect for spotting enemies before they got too close. Suddenly, movement caught their eyes. 3 figures appeared on the distant plain, moving cautiously, rifles in hand. Jackson counted them quickly. "They're scouts," he whispered. "They're looking for us." Little Hawk's eyes widened, but she did not panic. She had learned to trust Jackson, and she stayed quiet, following his lead. Jackson studied the rocks around them, noting every ridge, every shadow, every place they could hide. "We'll let them come closer," he said. "Then we'll strike from the sides."
"Use the rocks for cover. Don't let them see you until I say."
Little Hawk nodded, her small hands trembling slightly but her eyes steady. She was ready to face the danger with him. The outlaws moved closer, unaware of the trap waiting for them. Jackson and Little Hawk crouched behind a large rock, hidden from view. Jackson checked his gun and whispered instructions to the girl. "When I fire, you throw stones and make noise. We need to confuse them, make them think there are more of us than there really are." Little Hawk nodded again, understanding her role. The first outlaw reached the narrow part of the canyon. Jackson took careful aim and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the rocks. The outlaw fell to the ground, startled and confused. The other 2 froze, trying to figure out what had happened. Jackson motioned to Little Hawk. She picked up a handful of rocks and tossed them toward the ridges, making loud, clattering sounds. The outlaws looked around, unsure where the attack was coming from. Jackson moved silently along the side of the canyon, staying low and using every rock for cover. Little Hawk followed, keeping close. Together, they used the terrain to their advantage, surprising the outlaws with sudden shots and distractions. The outlaws fired back, but Jackson had positioned them in a way that minimized risk. He had learned from the previous ambush, and now controlled the battlefield. One of the outlaws tried to climb a small ridge to get a better angle, but Jackson's sharp aim forced him back down. The other fired wildly, but Jackson and Little Hawk were careful and calculated. The desert echoed with the sound of gunfire, rocks tumbling and stones clattering, creating chaos that confused their enemies. Little Hawk's cleverness amazed Jackson. She was small, but she moved quickly and silently, making it seem as if more people were helping him than there actually were. As the fight continued, Jackson noticed another group of outlaws approaching from a distant ridge. They were more numerous than he had expected. He realized they needed a decisive move. He signaled to Little Hawk, "We have to make them believe the canyon is more dangerous than it is. Stay quiet and follow my lead." Jackson led the horse into a narrow opening, making the outlaws think they had an escape route. He fired carefully at shadows, then moved to the side, using the rocks to block their view. Little Hawk threw rocks from a different angle, making noise and drawing attention. The outlaws hesitated, unsure where to attack. Jackson realized their confusion was their advantage. He whispered to Little Hawk, "We can push them toward the canyon's exit. They'll run into trouble if they follow." The plan worked. The outlaws advanced, thinking they were closing in, but Jackson and Little Hawk had prepared the ground. Rocks and uneven terrain forced the outlaws to stumble, and some fell into small gullies hidden by sand and shadows. Jackson's accurate shots kept them off balance, while Little Hawk's clever distractions made them hesitate. The outlaws were skilled, but they were unprepared for a team that used the land so cleverly. Jackson and Little Hawk moved quickly, staying hidden as they watched the remaining outlaws struggle. One finally surrendered, realizing they were trapped and outsmarted. Jackson approached cautiously, keeping his gun ready, while Little Hawk stayed close behind. The outlaw raised his hands, fear in his eyes. Jackson did not lower his weapon until he was sure the danger had passed. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, Jackson and Little Hawk took a moment to catch their breath. The desert was quiet again, the chaos of the battle fading into the wind. Little Hawk looked at Jackson, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and pride.
We did it," she whispered.
Jackson nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Yes, we did." Together, they checked the area for any remaining threats, then led the horse along a safe path away from the canyon. The fight had been intense, but it had strengthened their bond. Little Hawk had proven herself brave and clever, and Jackson had realized that the girl was not just someone to protect. She was a partner, a teammate, and a true survivor. As they moved through the desert, Jackson spoke quietly. "You were amazing back there. Most adults wouldn't have done half of what you did." Little Hawk blushed but did not speak. She had learned that words were not always necessary. Her actions had said enough. The sun began to set, painting the desert in deep shades of orange and red. Jackson and Little Hawk found a small, hidden plateau where they could rest for the night. Jackson tied the horse and helped Little Hawk down, then checked the surrounding area for safety. They built a small fire, careful to keep it low, and shared what little food they had. The quiet of the desert at night was comforting after the chaos of the day, but Jackson remained alert. He knew more challenges could come at any moment. Little Hawk sat close to him, her small body tired but steady. She spoke softly, telling him more about her journey and the people who had attacked her family. Jackson listened carefully, offering comfort and understanding. He realized that her past had been filled with pain, but her courage and determination were stronger than any fear. As night deepened, Jackson taught Little Hawk more survival skills. He showed her how to move silently in the dark, how to watch for hidden dangers, and how to use the desert's natural features for protection. Little Hawk listened intently, absorbing every word. Jackson could see her growing more confident, more capable, and more ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The stars filled the sky, bright and clear. Jackson thought about the events of the day, the ambush, the battle, and the clever use of the terrain. He realized that they had survived not just because of skill, but because they had worked together. Little Hawk had proven that bravery and intelligence were just as important as experience and strength. Jackson and Little Hawk slept lightly that night, taking turns keeping watch. Jackson felt a deep respect for the girl and a strong sense of responsibility. He had saved her life, yes, but she had also taught him something important. Courage was not just about fighting. It was about surviving, learning, and trusting others. By dawn, they were ready to move again, stronger and wiser. The desert had tested them, but it had also prepared them for the dangers still ahead. Jackson knew that the final confrontation with the outlaws was not far off. They would have to stay alert, clever, and united if they hoped to survive. And as the morning light touched the desert, Jackson and Little Hawk rode forward together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their bond was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of danger and courage, and nothing in the desert could break the trust between them. They were a team, and they would face the outlaws and any other danger with courage, skill, and determination. The desert morning was crisp and quiet. Jackson Cole led the horse along a hidden trail, his eyes scanning every ridge and shadow. Little Hawk rode close behind him, alert and ready. The events of the past days had tested them both. They had survived an ambush, a deadly trap, and the harsh desert itself. But Jackson knew that the final challenge was near. The outlaws were still out there, and their journey to safety was not yet complete. Jackson glanced at Little Hawk. She had grown stronger, braver, and wiser in these days. The fear that had once clouded her eyes had been replaced by determination and courage. She was no longer just a child in danger. She was a partner, a fighter, and a survivor. Jackson felt a sense of pride and respect. He had saved her, but she had also saved herself in many ways. The trail they followed led them to a small ridge overlooking the desert plain. Jackson slowed the horse and studied the land carefully. In the distance, he could see faint movement, figures approaching slowly. Outlaws. He signaled to Little Hawk to stay low. She crouched, her small hands gripping the saddle, eyes scanning the horizon. Jackson realized that this would be their final test, and they had to be ready. Jackson whispered a plan to Little Hawk. "We'll use the rocks and the ridge. You distract them with noise and movement. I'll aim carefully, and we'll push them back. Stay calm, stay focused." Little Hawk nodded, her face serious but determined. She understood the plan completely. She had learned from him, and now her courage would be tested again. The outlaws advanced, unaware of the trap waiting for them. Jackson took careful aim and fired, sending the first man stumbling back. The sound echoed across the desert. Little Hawk quickly picked up stones and threw them, creating noise and confusion. The outlaws hesitated, unsure where the attack was coming from. Jackson and Little Hawk moved with precision, using the rocks for cover and striking from unexpected angles. One outlaw tried to climb the ridge to get a better shot, but Jackson fired quickly, forcing him back down. The others hesitated, distracted by the noise and movement. Little Hawk continued to throw rocks, guiding the outlaws' attention away from their true position. Jackson smiled faintly, impressed by her skill and courage. She had learned quickly and was now a true partner in this fight. The battle continued for what felt like hours. Jackson and Little Hawk moved silently and cleverly, staying hidden while the outlaws grew frustrated and disoriented. The desert echoed with the sound of gunfire, rocks tumbling and stones clattering. Jackson realized that their teamwork and understanding of the land were giving them the advantage. The outlaws were skilled, but they were not prepared for two opponents who knew the desert so well. Suddenly, one of the outlaws stumbled into a small gully hidden by sand and rocks. He fell with a cry, and the others froze, unsure of what had happened. Jackson seized the moment and fired carefully at the remaining men. Little Hawk threw stones, creating more distractions and drawing their attention away from Jackson. The outlaws were trapped, confused, and overwhelmed. Jackson moved closer, keeping his gun ready. Little Hawk followed, staying low and alert. They had cornered the outlaws, and the battle was reaching its final stage. One by one, the remaining men surrendered or fled, realizing they were outmatched by the clever use of the terrain and the teamwork of their opponents. Jackson and Little Hawk had turned the desert into a battlefield they controlled. Once the last outlaw was gone, Jackson led the horse down the ridge and away from the open desert. Little Hawk leaned close, her small hand brushing his arm. She was exhausted but triumphant. Jackson could see the pride in her eyes, mixed with relief. They had survived, outsmarted the outlaws, and remained alive. The desert had tested them, and they had passed. Jackson and Little Hawk moved carefully toward a distant grove of trees. Jackson had learned that water and shade awaited there, and it would be a safe place to rest before reaching the Apache camp. Little Hawk pointed out small trails and hidden streams along the way. using her knowledge of the land to guide them. Jackson admired her awareness and skill. She had become a capable and courageous companion. By afternoon, they reached the grove. The shade of the trees offered relief from the harsh sun, and a small stream provided fresh water. Jackson helped Little Hawk down from the horse, and she drank eagerly. They rested quietly, taking in the peaceful surroundings after the intensity of the battle. Jackson knew they were close to safety, but he also remained vigilant. Danger could appear at any moment. As they sat by the stream, Little Hawk spoke softly. "My family, my people, they will be safe now," she said. Jackson nodded. "Yes, we're almost there. We just need to keep moving a little more, and you'll be home." Little Hawk's eyes filled with hope and relief. She had survived so much, and now the thought of returning to her people gave her strength. They continued along the hidden trails, moving cautiously but steadily. Jackson kept a watchful eye on the horizon, while Little Hawk guided the way. They were close to the Apache camp now, and Jackson could feel the tension easing slightly. The desert had been dangerous, but it had also taught them both important lessons about courage, trust, and survival. Finally, in the late afternoon, they saw the Apache camp in the distance. Smoke rose gently from small fires, and figures moved among the tents. Jackson slowed the horse and approached carefully. Little Hawk's face lit up with joy and relief. She leaned forward, her voice full of emotion. "Home," she whispered. Jackson smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They had made it. As they entered the camp, the people recognized Little Hawk immediately. She ran toward her family, who embraced her with tears and relief. Jackson stayed back, giving them space, but he could see the gratitude and respect in their eyes. They had welcomed her home, safe and alive. Jackson felt a quiet pride. He had saved a life, yes, but he had also helped a brave girl return to her people. Little Hawk turned back to Jackson, her eyes shining. "Thank you for everything," she said, softly. Jackson nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You did most of it yourself," he replied. "I just helped guide you." She smiled, understanding the truth in his words. Together, they had survived the desert and the outlaws. Together, they had grown stronger. Jackson stayed in the camp long enough to make sure Little Hawk was safe and her family was well. The Apache people welcomed him respectfully, recognizing his bravery and skill. Jackson knew it was time to move on, but he also knew that the bond he had formed with Little Hawk would never be broken. They had shared danger, survival, and trust, and that connection would stay with them forever. As the sun began to set, Jackson mounted his horse. Little Hawk waved goodbye, a small smile on her face. Jackson tipped his hat and rode away, the desert stretching out before him. He had saved a life, faced danger, and survived one of the toughest tests the land could offer. But more importantly, he had witnessed courage, resilience, and the strength of a young girl who refused to give up. The desert was quiet, the wind gentle, and the horizon painted with gold and pink hues. Jackson rode slowly, reflecting on the journey. He had entered the desert expecting nothing more than another ride, another day. Instead, he had found adventure, danger, friendship, and respect. He had saved Little Hawk, but he had also learned from her the value of courage, quick thinking, and trust. By nightfall, Jackson had reached a small, safe area to rest for the night. He tied the horse and looked up at the stars. The desert was vast and beautiful, but it had also been harsh and unforgiving. Jackson thought about Little Hawk and the bond they had formed. He knew she would thrive among her people, strong and brave, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. and he knew that he had been a part of something extraordinary, a story of survival, courage, and trust that would stay with him forever. As he lay under the stars, Jackson reflected on the journey. The ambushes, the desert, the outlaws, and the survival skills they had used, all had tested them to their limits, but they had overcome. They had faced danger together, and the bond formed in those trials would never be forgotten. Jackson understood that this adventure had changed him. He had entered the desert alone, but he was leaving with the knowledge that courage, trust, and teamwork could overcome even the harshest challenges. And in the quiet desert night, Jackson Cole rode on, knowing that somewhere out there, Little Hawk was safe, her family reunited, and her spirit unbroken. The journey had ended, but the story of survival, bravery, and trust would live on in their hearts forever.